Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University.
Hi, my name is Taryn from Arizona, and I'm in 5th grade. My question is, when was the Declaration adopted, and what do we celebrate on July 4th?
That was a really good question. So today's expert is Dr. Sean Beienberg. If you listen to the Arizona Civics podcast, you definitely know who Dr. Beienberg is. So Dr. Beienberg, will you introduce yourself and then kind of start answering our question? When was the Declaration adopted and why do we celebrate July 4th, right? We have picnics, we have fireworks, we have hot dogs. It's this big party, but why July 4th?
Hi, I'm Sean Beienberg. I'm an associate professor in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. I'm a constitutional historian with a particular focus on federalism, a lot of interest in separation of powers, as well as you alluded to, Arizona constitutional history, Arizona constitutional development. So those are my focuses primarily. So when you ask, what do we celebrate, or what are we celebrating, or what's the Declaration? In some sense, to be a little impish, there are two declarations of independence that one can think about. So there's a kind of fun letter that John Adams sends to his wife Abigail when he is saying that Independence Day will be the most memorable epoch, like time basically, in the history of America. And he says it will be celebrated by generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized, made special with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of the continent to the other from this time forevermore. And he mails that letter on July 3rd, 1776. And he says that that's how we would remember July 2nd, 1776. Because for John Adams, he thought that the day that would be the most important was when the Second Continental Congress actually voted to declare independence. So the Virginian Richard Henry Lee had written a short declaration. It's just a paragraph, so I'll flag it to you here, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And then they go on to basically say that they should put together a plan to work together to secure this. So it's effectively just a literal declaration of independence. But the Continental Congress had been anticipating this vote, and so they had already been thinking about Lee's proposal for a month. And so they had arranged to have not just this sort of literally we're declaring independence, but in some sense, a list of why, an explanation of why, not just the what. And so they had commissioned a committee of John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Roger Sherman, who I think is one of the real underappreciated founders, and Robert Livingston to draft this much more comprehensive justification. And so they'd been kicking around what Jefferson had been doing. Jefferson ended up being the primary draftsman for complicated reasons. With a little help from Franklin and Adams, the other two didn't have too much to do with it. So Congress looks over the draft and they tweak it, and I'm sure we'll talk in subsequent podcasts about what some of those tweaks were. But then they approve the sort of like explanation or justification. And as the Declaration says, declaring independence is a big deal. And so they don't want to do it lightly or for sort of for transient causes. And so they thought we have to really explain what we're doing and why, and particularly to show why this was a revolution that was justified in the sense that they had been trying to do things the right way. They'd been trying to do things with petitions, through protests, asking the British government to basically follow British law. And so they said, and the British government is failing to respond. We have no actual normal political way to do this. And so therefore we need to wield the right of revolution, which we'll talk more about, I think, in subsequent podcasts. And so that ended up being, ironically, despite John Adams's expectation, what was what was celebrated was not the actual, in a sense, Declaration of Independence when they were saying we're quitting, but the sort of explanation from it. So there's a historian that I really like, Pauline Maier, who said, what we celebrate is not Independence Day. In a sense, Independence Day is July 2nd, 1776. But as she said, we're celebrating Declaration of Independence Day. When they go through and explain and offer the justifications and both the really rich theoretical, philosophical discussion as well as the sort of list of indictments of the rights, the structures that the Americans thought were important that they thought had been violated.
Why do you think that more Americans know about like the Declaration of Independence, this July 4th, this Thomas Jefferson, as opposed to the July 2nd, like smaller one from Richard Henry?
So Richard Henry Lee's document is in some sense, again, very much it's very bare bones. Like there's a sense in which it's very clean and quick, but it basically just says we're independent. It doesn't explain why. It doesn't really. It's not that. I don't want to say it's not thoughtful of a document. It has a specific goal, which is we are independent. But it's an assertion, I guess, is what I would say. The Declaration of Independence is an explanation, and it comes to encapsulate both the sorts of core philosophical beliefs of the American political project, as well as, I think, as we'll talk about in subsequent podcasts, the institutional understandings that the Americans have, like what a proper government ought to look like and how the British government had failed to implement that. And so the Declaration of Independence, there are some historians who've argued that it sort of fell away for a while in importance. They go back and forth on this, and that's not a debate that I've really gotten super well versed in. But particularly in the years before and up to the Civil War, Americans are sort of trying to figure out, like, what are we actually about? What do we believe? Lincoln picks this up perhaps most famously. The Seneca Falls Declaration is very explicitly modeled on the Declaration of Independence as well. So the Declaration of Independence by Jefferson really is a nice encapsulation of most of the basic principles of the American political project. So it's a nice, concise, you can sit down and read it in just a couple of minutes, really. Explanation of sort of what the American project is about in a way that Richard Henry Lee's is just simply almost, as the kids, I guess, would say, like, peace out, Britain. Like, we're not doing this anymore. So the Declaration of Independence from Jefferson really is a thoughtful and pretty thorough. One of the things that I'll definitely be talking about in one of the other podcasts I want to do is how it's built on earlier assertions. In some sense, the Declaration of Independence is sort of a second draft of this set of critiques and complaints. So it's not just like dashed out lightly. Jefferson, says at one point in one of his letters later in life that he wasn't really innovating anything. He was collecting the ideas that were percolating in the American people at the time, picking up things from, we'll talk about, like Locke and Montesquieu, the Virginia Declaration of Rights written by George Mason. So it's really a nice encapsulation of what the American founding generation believed and what, in many ways, I think, hopefully Americans continue to believe.
So what I'm hearing you say is we should celebrate July 2nd and July 4th.
I think it's at least worth acknowledging. I think the celebration is probably more important than the particular date, as Adam says. This is something that we should take seriously and not just treat as a barbecue. So, as he says, some of it's going to be a little more flippant, games, sports, guns, bells, and bonfires, and some of it might be a little more serious. Solemnized by acts of devotion to God Almighty, or thinking through looking at these documents instead of just treating it as a day off. The content, as with most things, is more important, I think, than the which calendar date it is, because they're both they're complementary.
Yes.
So I don't think it would be a bad thing if we did the second instead, but I do think we should at least acknowledge poor Richard Henry Lee, who was the one pushing for this for a while, who's been largely forgotten.
Yes.
So both and.
Yes, both and. Thank you so much, Dr. Beienberg. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.